This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
So I was asked to try and draw out some themes, synthesis, if you like, conclusions from the day, which I'll try to do. Actually, just beforehand, when we were over coffee, I said to Carlos, what I'm going to say, and he said, well, just listen to Jose de Echave. And in fact, a lot of what Jose said, I think does serve as a sort of set of conclusions for the day. But I just want to add a few more things and elaborate some of the ideas that Jose raised. Before I do that, however, I just want to, because otherwise this might get lost at the end, once again thank Peru Support Group and Bolivia Information Forum for the day. And thank them in a way for their very existence, because they're very strange, unique sorts of body in that they're not really NGOs in the ways that people typically think of NGOs. They don't run projects. They don't have to report against monitoring and evaluation frameworks. They exist as bodies that bring people and organizations together as a vehicle for, on the one hand, informing, and on the other hand, doing public education and doing advocacy work on certain issues that are closely related to their particular agenda and missions. And so, that's by way of saying thank you to ESG and BIF, but also to say, please do, on the table, there are membership forms for the Peru Support Group. So if you feel so moved, please do take one of those if you are not already a member and sign up and become a member. And there's a range of members and patrons of Peru Support Group. Everything from archbishops or cardinals through to people like us. So, so please do that. In the case of Bolivia Information Forum, it works slightly differently, but please go to their website if you're so interested and explore the website, and you can find a way of signing up for, and Alex will correct me if I'm wrong on this, signing up for their regular information sheets, which is truly very, very useful. It's useful in all sorts of ways, just to keep informed. It's useful for teaching, for those of you who teach, particularly at an undergraduate level. It's useful for nuggets on a country that otherwise doesn't get much coverage in the UK press or the European press more generally. And I can also say from the States, save the great article in New York Times, doesn't get much coverage there. So please do, if you feel so moved, take the membership form for PhD and go to BIF's website to sign up for the information sheet. I think the idea is I'll try and say a few things, and then we'll just open the floor. Amy will open the floor at the very end for overarching observations that people here might want to make about the day and about some of the themes that have been raised during the day. So I divided my comments, I'm not sure the division works perfectly, between half a dozen comments that are to do with dilemmas or tensions that I think have been present during the day, and then 3 or 4 comments that are more, they're all substantive, but are less about dilemmas and tensions and more about issues that strike me as important, that have come across in various presentations today. So the first dilemma or tension, which I think has been implicit in some of the presentations and has not been made as explicit as it might have been, is the relationship between thinking about the implications of extractive industries at a national level and thinking about the implications of extractive industries particularly at a local level. There are lots of things that could be said here in this dilemma, but one of them that I want to draw attention to is the notion that the sector generates important tax revenue, important royalty revenue that has been used in the countries that we've talked about primarily today for, among other things, important infrastructural investments, and particularly important social investments. And those social investments, in the form of conditional and unconditional cash transfers, appear to have had important effects, or noticeable effects, on poverty rates. Not necessarily inequality rates, but poverty rates. So there's an interesting and positive story there at a national level about the relationship between extractives and social investments. There's also a story about rights. There's a story about rights of citizens to transfers and to investments and to retention from their state. But then there's also another story, it's also about rights, at a local level, where it's not, I think the presentations today have said that local populations are against extractive projects at all. But that clearly is the domain in which conflict has been concentrated and been sustained. So something's happening there at that level, around expectations, around rights, around visions of the future, that's culminating in conflict. So there's a dilemma there. There's a dilemma about how to square those two sets of concerns, which are not just questions about relations of scale. It's really a question about relationships between different sets of rights and different sets of claims. Rights to certain forms of being in a local environment, and rights, it's not just a dichotomy, but and rights, I'll say it that way, rights to access to support from the state which previously has not been provided in the past, at a national scale. So there's a dilemma there. And there's a sub-dilemma in that, which is a dilemma that I think was most present in Carlos's presentations, that there is the fear and a possible tendency that that tension gets resolved. There's a temptation to resolve it through authoritarian means, through mechanisms that bring in certain sets of human rights, or certain sets of rights. So there's one set of dilemmas there that I think have been present during the day that I don't think we've pushed on as hard as we might have done, but I think really it's a real issue. Related to that, closely related to that, I think, is another dilemma, which is to do with the relationship between the national level and the subnational levels. And I think, in that regard, during the day, there has possibly been something of a tension between some of the things that Jose has said and some of the things that Carlos has said, just to use those as two examples. It's not an irresolvable one, but it's a matter of emphasis around arguments for centralization and arguments for decentralization. Whether it's decentralization in the form of revenue transfer, whether it's decentralization in the form of land use planning, whether it's decentralization in the form of regional authorities having a say over extractive projects. And arguments for centralization are in terms of centralization in order to be able to carry through on a project of national liberation and sovereignty. Centralization in order to carry through on projects of massive social investment at a national scale using revenues from extractives. But there's a tension there, I think, in the day. There's been present, and different presentations have given different emphasis to the centralization and decentralization. Again, it's not a dichotomy, but it's a relationship that lies at the core of the character of any particular democracy. We lived that here in the UK through the whole debate about the metropolitan councils. Among other things, there was also discussion about centralization, central and subnational, just as an example. So I think there's an issue there that merits more thought. And I think what it also means is the extractive industries discussion is going to be one of the terrains in which discussion about decentralization and the relationship between central and authorities and decentralized authorities gets worked out in these countries. The third dilemma was raised by the discussion around capacities. I guess it's a dilemma of time, or maybe it's a dilemma of waiting, of how far one can wait. Because the discussion about capacities was also a discussion about the time it takes for capacities to emerge and to get built over time. In recent years, I've been involved in some work with the government of El Salvador, who commissioned a strategic environmental assessment for the mining sector in El Salvador. The outcome of that was to conclude that levels of social and environmental vulnerability are so serious in El Salvador El Salvador couldn't afford the possible risks associated with the growth of a mining sector for the time being. And that what it had to do was build capacities to be able to regulate that sector in every sense of the term prior to that sector growing. And so that culminated in draft legislation that would do just that. It would put the mining sector on hold until capacities had been built. Now you can have that sort of conversation in a country like El Salvador. Obviously, at the national level, that conversation is completely irrelevant for a country like Peru or Bolivia or Ecuador, where different parts of the extractive economy are so consolidated that it's not an issue of if, it's an issue of how. But part of that issue of how is also potentially an issue of waiting. How long might one wait to build certain sorts of capacities, nationally or subnationally? But can one wait too long? Around the Quellaveco example is the possibility that society and regional authorities may ask too much, and the project can be made to wait too long, that in the end it doesn't fly. And if Quellaveco doesn't fly under its current design, and this is another dilemma for activists, I assume, if it doesn't fly in its current design, one likely response will be other mining companies saying, look, I told you so. This is what happens when you try and incorporate too many costs and try and pursue a project development process this way. So anyhow, I think there's a dilemma about time, about capacities, time, waiting, how long can waiting occur and how long is too much waiting. There's a dilemma around Dutch disease in the case of Peru. I'm not going to say much more about that, except to kind of paraphrase a conversation with Rosemary leaving the room after the session, in which she was saying, well, if it's at this stage, it's very, very hard to know what to do. You could devalue, but then you have more problems with inflationary pressures in the economy. But there's clearly a dilemma that's confronting Peru head-on in how to manage exchange rate depreciation, which presumably means that looking not too far forward, the government of Bolivia should be anticipating that dilemma and thinking about how to manage it before it becomes unmanageable. Another dilemma around the presentation that wasn't given, but I wanted to comment on this, which is Carlos Larrea's presentation about Yasuni. I'm sure most of you, or all of you, know the nature of the Yasuni proposal, which is the notion that interested parties, governments, would put money into an account that would be available for the government of Ecuador, and in return for that account, the hydrocarbon resources in Yasuni would stay underground. They wouldn't be exploited. There are a whole bunch of interesting aspects of that experiment and particular design problems to do with that experiment. But there's a larger issue that I don't know if Carlos would have talked about, but it came up in a seminar I was in 18 months ago now, at which was present the then, I don't know if still, ambassador of Ecuador to Germany. And one of his charges, his principal charge in Berlin, was to advocate to raise resources for the Yasuni project. But what he was also saying in the seminar is, whatever the case, the oil frontier in Ecuador is going to carry on moving south. And whatever the case, the large-scale mining frontier is going to carry on moving south and southeast. So the dilemma there is, it's again a dilemma about focusing on projects or on whole sectors. And clearly there's a lot of symbolic value in the Yasuni experiment. But it doesn't necessarily it resolves issues for indigenous peoples living in voluntary isolation in the area of Yasuni, and that's of course critical, because it's ultimately an issue of genocide. But it's a project, it's not a sector issue. So a dilemma there. And I had one about small-scale mining, but time's running forward, so I'll skip that. Just to say that clearly there's much more mileage there. So a few substantive issues which I don't think hang together very well, but we'll try. I I think I tried to say at the beginning of the day that one of the things that's important to bear in mind is that extractives are always part of something else. They're always part of some other project, some larger project, but they're part of another project. And it seems to me that that has been relatively clear today in some presentations more than others. And those different projects would lead to different calculations about what can be traded off, what shouldn't be traded off. It's not to say that those different projects are incompatible, necessarily so, but they are different, and they will imply different ways of regulating extraction. Hugh said something in his presentation about the importance of context for respectful discussion across differences. And it strikes me that that's one of the issues that this embedding of extractives in larger projects places full center. There are discussions here to be had about sovereignty, about rights, about democracy, as well as about particular projects. And if one only talks about the projects, the likelihood is ultimately the debate will be characterized by desencuentros, by kind of ships passing in the night. Because talking about the tail of the beast, not the beast, not the whole beast. So that's one observation during the day. I think that the day's made that clear that that's an issue. Which then relates to something that Caroline said about designing backwards. And I think today has raised issues about designing backwards, whether it's at the level of an individual mine site. Okay, very quickly. So, whether it's designing backwards an individual mining site or designing backwards a portfolio of $60 billion of investment in the pipeline, or designing backwards a territory. But in some sense, that designing backwards means making explicit some of these larger projects. What is it that actors visualize and want to see existing in a medium or long-term time horizon, and then planning backwards from that? One of the themes I think has been cut across the presentations today is that part of that planning backwards means taking some of the relative power of the corporate sector in that planning away. Not radically erasing it, but having planning processes in which it's not just the corporate sector planning, but instead that there are roles, and I think there have been, again, differences of opinion today on the relative roles of state and society in that process of planning backwards. And there have been different examples of the planning backwards. Jose talked about the transitions work. That's part of kind of planning backwards. Imagining the transition and then thinking how to move towards a transition. It's been there in discussions about ecological economic zoning and land use planning. It's really about, it's in a shorter term but not immediate time horizon. Imagining territories and planning backwards from that territory that one's imagining. When we launched the book over there in Peru the other week, one of the commentators was Carolina Trivelli, who's the Minister for Social Inclusion, Development and Social Inclusion now. But she comes from a background in rural development. And she made an observation which I think was important, that one of the reasons why discussions about extractives, and particularly mining, more than hydrocarbons, are so awkward and ultimately go off at half-cock in Peru is what there is no clarity on is a rural development policy. So if you don't have a rural development policy, you don't have points of reference against which to assess what the role of extractives would be in that broader rural development policy. So that's also about planning backwards, having rural development scenarios and then planning backwards the place of extractives within that. That planning backwards was also challenge issues about identity and the ways in which notions of identity get mobilized in these discussions. It would imply that it's not necessarily the case that one's historical identity defines one's future identity. I come from Stoke-on-Trent, which at a certain time might have been thought of as a mining region, at least in mining, ceramics, iron and steel. That was the complex that I grew up in. And it's gone. It's not a mining region anymore. It's a services, and sadly services region. But the more general point is that planning backwards would call into question the idea that one should use the notion of inherent identities to justify particular economic strategies, because the future may be very different from the past. And finally, actually not finally here, but finally I'm going to start, is the thing of, we haven't talked much today about, it's been in questions, but about, or maybe we could have talked more, about prior consultation, or free, prior and informed consent, or whichever label one wants to use, stronger or weaker, to talk about the issue at stake. Obviously, prior consultation and free, prior, informed consent is much more than this, but one of the things that it is, arguably, and I think again the Quelueco experience suggests this, is that it's a process through which costs that would otherwise be externalized get identified and can become internalized in project design. But of course, it's much more than that. But I think it's playing that purpose as well. I think in that sense, the Quelueco experience is once again very important. But free, prior, and informed consent will also be a terrain on which notions of rights will get discussed and expanded, from indigenous rights to non-indigenous people's rights. And as I was thinking about free, prior, and informed consent, I was thinking about something else that Hugh said, which was that in the Quelueco process, the formal and the informal merged was the language he used. And I think there's a lesson there, and the implication was the informal is at least as important as the formal, and probably more important. And that's, I think, an important lesson for the free, prior, and informed consent discussion. The implication is that the formalities of free, prior, and informed consent are only a small part of what's at stake. And that ultimately free, prior, and informed consent is, and has to be, which is how it's conceptualized, an ongoing process in which these sets of informal demands and concerns and complaints continue to be, have a vehicle through which they can be expressed, and new agreements can be made. And that's important because, as Carlos was saying earlier on, agreements don't last, they never last. Michael Ross has said much the same. They last a while, people change, situations change, and then the agreements unfold. So the notion that free, prior, and informed consent ultimately becomes a more permanent platform for what becomes participatory adaptive planning of change in the local environment seems to me to be important to bear in mind, and to, again, one of the ways of thinking through the links between the sector and changing and hopefully consolidating forms of local democracy in areas, in local and national, but particularly local democracy, in areas affected by extraction. So just a few thoughts. I should say, Carlos, that I said something about Yasuni, and I'm sure you're going to say something quite different. But anyway, it's great to see you, and thank you very much for the organising.